So my name is Danny Echikson. I'm a Columbia College, class of 2017, and I am in Columbia University's Columbia University and Slavery Seminar. So I stumbled across the Croix family at Columbia University's RBML about 3 or 4 months ago. And I opened up the box, and the first thing that I found was this note recording a labor revolt on St. Croix. That's an island in the northeast rim of the Caribbean. It's a labor revolt from 1878. And it mentions that 13 Afro-Cruisan laborers were burned in this barn. And it was in Columbia's RBML, so there must be some sort of connection. So I was immediately intrigued. What did Columbia University have to do with the goings-on of this island, thousands of miles away in 1878, after the end of slavery in the United States and after the end of slavery in St. Croix? And it turns out that Columbia University has a lot to do with the goings-on of this 1878 St. Croix labor revolt. And the two are tied primarily through this one family, the Croix family. The Croixes, this old New York family legend has that the first one, John Conrad, came to New York from Mannheim sometime before 1708. John Conrad was not very rich. He was a school teacher. He lived in New Jersey and he lived in New York. He had a son, Christopher, who was a felt maker. But Christopher sort of rose up socioeconomically during his lifetime. And by the time of his death in 1741, he was a judge. Now, Christopher owned slaves, okay? And there's actually a record of one of his slaves, Phyllis, that fell out of this Anglican prayer book. And the thing about the Croixes is they're connected to slavery via this island in the Caribbean, and they're also connected right at home. So slavery is not just an impersonal force in their life, it's also this very personal thing. And Christopher's slave, Phyllis, really demonstrates this. Phyllis served the Croix family her entire life. Christopher was also involved in the 1742 slave conspiracy in New York. And one of his slaves, Cambridge, was implicated in this trial, and Christopher and Cambridge's interests actually aligned. So, so Cambridge, because he was implicated in this conspiracy, risked being deported or even worse, executed. So in 1742, New York experienced a slave conspiracy. A number of buildings started burning, and at this time, the number of slaves in New York was increasing rapidly. So paranoia was high, and rumor spread that it was slaves doing this. So a grand jury was formed, and it turns out one of Christopher Croix's slaves was implicated in this burning. Now what's interesting is Christopher and his slaves' interests were aligned. If Christopher's slave was convicted, then he risked deportation to a place far away from all his families and friends, or even worse, execution by burning at the stake. Christopher could be reprimanded, and at this time, slavery was quite valuable. A slave was valuable capital in New York, so he risked severe economic loss as well. Now, ultimately, Cambridge confessed that he was part of this plot, but later on, after that confession, he told his master, Christopher, that he gave a false confession. The only reason he gave a false confession is because he was pressured into it. And ultimately, he was deported to Cape St. Francois, and Christopher lost his slave and died a year later. 4 Croixes attended Columbia. David was class of 1798. He attended the college. George was class of 1810. He attended the college as well. Alexander Hamilton Croix, no relation to the actual Alexander Hamilton, died halfway through his studies in 1816, and George Washington Croix attended the medical school in 1825. Now, Columbia was both a merchant's college, as Craig Stephen Wilder writes in his book, but it was also a plantation college. This means that basically all the young men that were going to Columbia in its early days, King's College as well, were the sons of these wealthy New York merchants who were engaging in this West Indian trade. Now, the sons of these wealthy Southern and West Indian planters were very attractive to the college because these planters were just vastly wealthy and lived incredibly opulent lifestyles. And there were no educational facilities in the West Indies, so they sent their sons to places like Columbia and places like Harvard and places like Yale. It was not as far away as a place like Oxford or Cambridge. It was very convenient. So in the 1750s, Columbia sent a recruiting mission down to the West Indies and tried to get a bunch of these planters. Now the Conwises are interesting because they demonstrate both sides of this. That demonstrate both the sort of plantation side of Columbia, and they demonstrate both the Merchants College side of Columbia. But more than that, slavery for the Conwises was this very personal force. So we have this record of David attending something called the Candlelight Frolic, which was basically a party. He attended in 1796 when he was a junior at Columbia. And in this document that indicates that slaves helped to set up this party, and they also played music for the young revelers at this party. So slavery was this very personal thing in his life. It existed, slaves financed his leisure, and his dad was also a West Indian merchant. They financed his education at Columbia. Both his consumption and the way his wealth was produced was done by slaves. Now, David graduated in 1798. He was salutatorian of Columbia College, and he went on to become a lawyer. In his early days, he helped finance West Indian trade voyages with his brother. His ships would go to St. Croix, pick up the sugar produced by slaves, bring it back to New York, and then they would distribute it to retailers for the consumption of New Yorkers. He used the wealth he generated in his youth as this West Indian trader to eventually found the Farmers Fire Insurance and Loan Company. And this is interesting because it demonstrates the continuities between the sort of older slave economy and the rise of these financial capitalistic institutions. Now, David also participated in a number of, slavery for him was a very political category. So even after he graduated, even after slavery ended in New York in the 1820s, he still opined about slavery. So his wife, Patty Livingston, was a member of the Female Society for the Support of Free Schools in Africa. She was also a board member on the Colored Orphans Asylum. He attended this meeting in the 1850s that was for the Missouri Compromise and against the Kansas-Nebraska Act. So even though slavery had ended, it was ended as a personal force in his life 30, 40 years prior, he engaged politically with it for the rest of his life. And he engaged with it in another way too. So David's father was made all his money in the West Indian trade. He traded sugar. And David's father, George, developed a number of contacts in the West Indies on this island, St. Croix. Now, one of David's brothers, James, actually ended up inheriting a plantation on St. Croix. So in 1797 or 1798, he married a woman named Rebecca Rogers. And Rebecca Rogers' father owned a number of plantations. So Rebecca Rogers' father passed away. James was in his will, inherited this plantation. James moved to St. Croix sometime before 1810. Now on St. Croix, he owned over 200 slaves, and just he grew sugar, but he wasn't a very successful planter. And in 1827, a large storm destroyed his crop. David was involved with slavery in another way too. In 1797, his brother, James, married a woman named Rebecca Rogers and inherited a plantation on St. Croix because Rebecca Rogers' father had owned a number of these plantations. When he inherited this plantation on St. Croix, he came into possession of hundreds of human beings because St. Croix was an island in the West Indies where they produced sugar, and the sugar was produced almost entirely with slave labor. Now, James's son ended up attending Columbia too. James's son attended in 1825. And it goes to show how the money generated in the slave economy was what basically financed Columbia University in these early days. Many sons of planters attended Columbia, and many sons of the traders who engaged in this trade between the West Indies and New York, a trade that's basically based on human slavery, would have attended Columbia too, and they paid their dues with the money generated in that trade.